Hey everyone, my name is Bryan Hong, and I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Toronto. And I'm excited to be here today to be sharing one of the projects I've been working on for the last little bit with Carly Pastana, Dr. Michael Mack, and Dr. Morgan Burns. Now, our episodic memory system grants us this remarkable ability to travel back in time. When we remember moments from our past, we can mentally place ourselves back to that place and time where that initial event occurred. And in turn, this helps us to search through the contents of our memory. What we're looking at here is a painting by Edward Hopper. And although he probably painted this with the expanse of the American landscape in mind, I think it illustrates this property of our memory system quite nicely. I want you to imagine you're on a road trip, you're driving down this scenic route, and you're looking in your rearview mirror. You can see all the telephone poles start to blur together, and you lose the detail associated with each individual one. Now, if you think back to a given point on that road, so maybe you think back to this nice house you saw, you can jump back to that point in time, and now all the details come flooding back with high vividness and fidelity. And the idea here is that that can help you guide your subsequent memory search. Now, this aspect of memory search has been studied quite extensively using the free recall tasks using word lists. And they show how different associations in memory can help organize retrieval. So let's say, for example, I ask you to learn this list of words. You see the word dog, then you see king, book, hammer, queen, and then ketchup. And then afterwards, I ask you to freely recall as many of those words as you can remember in whatever order you wish. Returning back to that idea of mental time travel, our recall for a given word is going to bring us back to that same point in time when we first initially encoded that item on the list. And it's going to be analogous to activating the surrounding items like a spotlight. Let's say, for example, one of your participants recalls the word hammer during recall. The idea is that the contextual states associated with that item from that list are going to be reactivated. And thus, similar contextual states are going to be partially activated. So you're going to be more likely to recall the words book or queen next. As a result of this, it manifests into these two consistent patterns of clustering that we see during recall. First, what we see is this temporal contiguity effect, or this temporal clustering at recall. We tend to recall words in a similar order to which they were initially encoded. So I'll just direct our attention to that graph over there. On the y-axis, what we have is the conditional response probability. And that refers to your likelihood of saying a given word conditional on what you just said. On our x-axis, what we're looking at is the temporal lag, which gives you an indication of the proximity of that word to the word that you just said on that given list. So let's say, for example, you say the word hammer. A lag of +1 would be the word queen, or the next item on that list. And then the word book, or would be a lag of -1. And what we see is this kind of canonical peak shape in that conditional response probability curve. So what that says is when you recall a word, you're more likely to say those words that are surrounding it. Secondly, we see what's also called a semantic proximity effect. So we also have this tendency to recall items that are semantically similar to one another as well. So the idea here is that semantically similar words, over a lifetime of experiences, you're going to see them in similar temporal contextual states. And that's also going to be helping to guide your recall. So here on the y-axis, we have the same conditional response probability I just mentioned. But now on the x-axis, we have semantic similarity. And there's a positive relationship between the two. So when you recall a word like queen, you're going to be more likely to recall a word that's semantically similar, like king, rather than a low semantic similar word like hammer. Now, these findings of clustering are quite robust across many participants. So here, what we're looking at are individual plots plotting the conditional response probabilities as a function of lag and semantic similarity across a multitude of participants in this given study. And what we can see is that we have this canonical peak-shaped curve for all of those temporal contiguity plots. And then you see this positive relationship for semantic similarity. Now, despite its robustness, what we also see is that there's individual differences to the degree in the clustering that you observe at recall. So some people rely more on these temporal associations or are better able to guide their recall according to them. And similarly, some people use semantic associations. Now, the reason that these retrieval dynamics are important is that we can use them to predict subsequent memory. So what we're looking at here are the results from a meta-analysis from various list learning paradigms, looking at the degree of temporal clustering and semantic clustering with overall recall. So how many words from that list you can remember. What they find here is that there's a correlation between temporal contextual reinstatement or temporal clustering, but not semantic clustering with overall recall in the list. So what that says is the more you cluster your items based on temporal associations from encoding, the better you're able to remember those items from that list. However, this was the case for word lists consisting of items that are largely selected at random. So there's not a lot of semantic similarity between any two items on that list. In this study, recent study over here, they investigated the same question, but used two different types of lists. So we have related lists formed of items from semantic categories or drawn from distinct semantic categories. And then we also have those random lists as well. And what we can see is that for the random lists, we can replicate that effect that we see on the left. So you see that temporal clustering predicts recall, but for those related lists, it seems that semantic clustering might be driving recall. So this leads me to the current study. So what I wanted to investigate was whether emphasizing these different associations between encoding and free recall would affect how we recall those items. In standard list learning paradigms, we typically have these two phases. So you have an encoding phase and you have a recall phase. You first learn a list of items, and sometimes you might get a break or some sort of task in between. But generally, afterwards, you just recall as many of those items as you can. The goal here was to introduce this intermediate review period where we could give participants a second exposure to those items, where we either emphasize those initial temporal associations or the semantic associations between items. So first, we needed a data set to draw from where we could quantify the semantic similarity between items. Previous studies typically use these association models, such as word2vec or word association spaces, to capture these associations between items in these large text corpora. In this study, I wanted to see whether this would also fall out using these semantic feature norms. So this is drawn from a large-scale study where participants are presented with a given item, and then they're just asked to indicate as many semantic features they could for that given item. So for example, for a cat, you might say that it has fur and is a pet. And the idea here is that items that share many semantic features are going to be semantically related to one another. So what we did was we ran a k-metoids clustering analysis to form these semantic clusterings from this data. And here is just a UMAP projection to show those clusters that we identified. Okay, so we use these items to then construct these word lists that we have participants learn in our task. Specifically, we use this modified list learning task where we introduce this immediate review condition between the encoding and recall phase. We had 81 young adult participants not come in, but they ran the study on Prolific online, and they were randomly assigned to one of these three review conditions, which I'll explain shortly. So participants first learned 15 different words drawn from 3 distinct semantic categories. What you can also see here is that those words are overlaid atop images depicting this stepwise navigation along these spatial routes along the U of T campus. The idea here is that we want to bolster those temporal associations between items. So this is a sped up version here, but essentially the idea is that participants learned a word associated with each of the frames here. So we had a research assistant in the lab walk along these routes on U of T and snapshot along as they're walking through. And the idea here is that we wanted to kind of give the temporal associations a shot. So they're not these arbitrary associations between items that are typically presented on these blank background images in a standard list learning task. Now, the reason that this is important is that we could introduce this review period where we could emphasize these different associations that participants initially learned. So we had 3 different conditions here. In the temporal condition, you see the items in the same exact order that you had initially encoded them in. In the semantic review condition, we reorganize those items so that they're organized by their semantic category. So here we have onion, corn, turnip, radish, beets, so all the vegetables together. And then lastly, we have a random condition where they're randomly shuffled in this new order. And that kind of acted as a baseline control. The important thing is that the words were presented on the same background image that they were presented on from encoding. So you only really get that stepwise traversal through that route in that temporal review condition, but not semantic or random. Finally, we have participants recall as many of those words as they can remember in whatever order that comes to mind. Okay, so what did we find? Well, as you could probably predict, what we can see is that the organization of your recall is affected by however you review those items. So in this case, we see the strongest degree of temporal clustering for those participants with that temporal review condition. So going back to those temporal contiguity plots that we saw previously, we see that canonical peak shape for individuals in that temporal review condition in that purple line, but not in the pink or the green. What we can also do is derive a factor score, which gives us a single score to capture the amount of clustering that participants are doing. So I won't go into the details into how we calculate that, but to interpret it, that 0.5 just represents chance clustering. So you're not observing any temporal clustering. Anything above is that you are. And we can see that that purple bar is significantly greater than the pink and the green there. Now we can do a similar analysis for that semantic similarity as well. So we see that positive relationship between semantic similarity as derived from those feature norms with that conditional response probability, but it's steepest for that pink line. So individuals who reviewed those semantic associations between items. And all of the bars here are significantly above chance. So all of them are kind of picking up on those semantic clustering, but it's still higher for those in the semantic review condition. What we can then do is look at the relationship between these different clustering that we observe at recall and their overall recall. So how many words do you remember? So what we have are the different factor scores. So we have semantic on the top, temporal on the bottom, and we're going to have three different conditions. So temporal, semantic, and random. We conducted a generalized logistic linear mixed effects model, and we found that there was a significant main effect of temporal and semantic clustering with overall recall. But this is primarily driven by those participants in the semantic review condition over there. So what that's saying is that the more participants are exhibiting this temporal or semantic clustering during recall, the more words that they're able to draw out of memory. What this suggests is that maybe reviewing these semantic associations between items facilitates access to both of those sets of associations during recall, and that can help optimize your memory search later on. So I know we studied this in word lists, but we can probably imagine how this might scale up to the range of events. So let's go back to that road trip that we were taking at the beginning of this talk. And then rather than trying to review and construct that road trip based on the initial temporal order that we had initially encoded them in, it might be better to form these associations and try to draw these parallels between those different items. And that might help us draw different events from memory better later on. So the results of this study suggest that the way in which we review different items in memory can influence both the organization and the quantity of recall later on, which can help inform strategies that we use in different contexts, such as in a classroom setting, memory rehab setting, or when you're trying to remember what you had on your grocery list. Thank you again to my supervisors, Dr. Michael Mack and Dr. Morgan Brenz, and to Carly and Belinda for their help in making this work possible. And thank you all for listening.